In 2001, when Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast, much to the dismay and heartbreak of us Sega fans around the world, we had to find a new system to play Sega games. Here in the UK, both the GameCube and the Xbox were well over a year away, which left only one viable option if PAL gamers wanted a supported console in the here and now: the Sony PlayStation 2. So naturally, many Sega gamers turned to those trusty Dreamcast stands, seeing that they could actually play games too. It's hard to deny that the PlayStation 2 was an increasingly attractive prospect at the time. Despite an underwhelming first year, good games were finally arriving on the system, and soon this would include many from Sega. I picked up my PlayStation 2 in 2001, with a Sega game bundled with it, and throughout its life, the console would see more Sega games than any other publisher, say from EA and Sony themselves. In this video, I'm going to explore 10 games on the system which I feel reflect Sega's impact on Sony's sophomore system in PAL regions. I've split them up into 5 categories, which cover the range of approaches Sega had at the time when it comes to games on the platform. Now of course, these are PAL games, so be prepared for some interesting aspect ratios on the ones that aren't 60Hz optimized. So let's get into Sega on the PAL PS2.
Crazy Taxi!
We'll start with the Dreamcast ports. Every 6th gen console got a port of at least some Dreamcast titles in their early days, and the PS2 was no exception. It makes sense that when Sega made the pivot to third party in 2001, moving over their celebrated back catalogue would be a quick and easy way to make bank. We'll start with Crazy Taxi, released on the PS2 in 2001. For those that don't know, this is a port of the arcade classic and later Dreamcast game, where you drive through the city streets, picking up passengers and doing crazy stunts to rack up fares and get them to their destination as quickly as possible. This was the first game that I got with my PlayStation 2 that year, and as you can see, it's a shadow of its former Dreamcast self. So as first impressions go, it wasn't a great one. Like all the games on this list, this is the PAL version, which means we had to put up with a letterbox display and a 16.6% frame rate decrease. There's no 60Hz option in this game, it runs in interlace mode, which is a notable downgrade from the Dreamcast's 480p progressive scan. The voices have changed for the worse, and they're now really lacking in character.
Yeah, we're gonna have some fun!
I also noticed more frame rate drops. The DualShock 2's analog sticks aren't really suited to the experience with far more dead zones, and not having the shoulder triggers is also a bit of a frustration. All in all, it really feels like a rush job, a far cry from the best way to play the game. When I first got this on PS2, I felt like my Dreamcast was actually laughing at me from its place underneath the telly. Thankfully though, things would improve from here. 18-Wheeler Pro Trucker is the second game in the Dreamcast port section that I chose, and is a big step up from the Crazy Taxi port. You play as a truck driver, hauling trailers across stages in a race against the clock and your rival Lizardtail. It's a quirky and fun Sega arcade experience that has bags of personality, so make sure you check out the Sega-holics excellent retrospective for all the details. So as for the PS2 port, compared to Crazy Taxi, we now have an actual 60Hz option in PAL regions, so the game plays at full speed and at the right resolution. The image is still interlaced, so it's still a step down in terms of image quality compared to the Dreamcast, and there are a few differences in terms of lighting and textures, but this is still a far closer port. Considering this costs a fraction of the Dreamcast version, it's actually a worthy alternative. And it loads a little faster too, which is a fair trade-off for the fairly minor visual downgrade. The next category of games that I wanted to discuss on the PS2 were the compilations. Now we won't cover the Sega Classics collection, oh that is far too interesting, but the first one I'm going to talk about is Sonic Mega Collection Plus. A port of the 2002 GameCube collection with quite a few extras. This compilation features the 7 Mega Drive or Sega Genesis Sonic titles, plus extras such as the Ooze, Comic Zone and Ristar, though the requirements for unlocking those games are brutal. This applies to lock-on games too. The Sonic & Knuckles lock-on features need to be unlocked as standalone games. So for example, if you want to play Sonic 3 and Knuckles, you have to play both Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Sonic & Knuckles 20 times each before you can unlock that version of the game. These aren't native ports either, like Sonic Jam or Sonic Origins. Every game here is emulated, and given the age of the collection and the hardware they're on, they do have all sorts of issues, as well as some absolutely terrible PAL optimization. Still, there's some cool extras in here, and the Game Gear games are a welcome addition, especially those that you can play in split screen.
Virtual Cop Elite Edition!
The second collection I'm featuring here is Virtua Cop Elite Edition. Now this compilation of Virtua Cop 1 and Virtua Cop 2 is a native port of both games, once again with loads of extras. Both games here have had a visual makeover and run at a smooth 60 frames per second. They're not perfect, the more detailed visuals are hindered by blurry textures and some really drab colours, and the camera movement in-game seems a little incorrect at times. But with a fresh look, support for both GunCon peripherals, and representing good value for its content, this is an acceptable pack-in if you don't have access to the excellent Sega Saturn ports.
Pretty bold, aren't we? I'll take care of you myself.
Moving on from Sega bringing their old catalogue to PlayStation 2, new games would arrive soon, but now we're going to look at new multi-format games next. Games that came to other 6th gen systems at the same time, and we will start with Sonic Heroes. This 3D platformer follows on from Sonic Adventure 2, where this time you control a trio of characters as you aim to take down Dr. Robotnik and Metal Sonic. Sadly, the PS2 gets the raw deal here, with a game that not only suffers with an interlaced image, but runs at half the frame rate of the other versions and is missing a fair amount of level details. It is, without question, the ugliest and worst playing version of Sonic Heroes, which no doubt hurt the game's somewhat negative reputation even more, seeing as this port sold more copies and was in more gamers' hands than any other version of Sonic Heroes. And after playing Sonic Heroes and seeing the mixed results of the Dreamcast ports and compilations, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the PS2 was cursed for Sega titles. But then along comes Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast and just blows everything else away. A port of both the arcade Outrun 2 and SP titles, featuring both layouts as well as a host of additional content, this is, like I said of the original Xbox port, a masterpiece. Visually, this is so close to the Xbox and arcade versions that you'd be hard pressed to spot the difference, especially with a 480p mode to deliver some of the crispest visuals you will see on the PS2. It plays absolutely perfectly too, truly one of the greatest titles of its era. Despite being a multi-platform title, Outrun 2006 does have arcade roots, and that leads us on nicely to the next segment. Arcade ports, specifically those that only came to the PlayStation 2, are the order of the day here, and what better place to start than the outstanding Vampire Knight. Developed by Sega's WoW Entertainment team, but published by Namco, it was developed for the System 246 board, which was essentially an arcade version of the PS2 hardware. This means the port is arcade perfect, and what a game it is. This is a light gun shooter in the vein of both Sega and Namco, so think The House of the Dead if made by Namco, with cutscenes that certainly feel like Time Crisis in terms of cheesy delivery. With non-linear paths, cracking light gun gameplay, excellent sound and visuals, and a superb atmosphere, this is essential for Sega fans on the PlayStation 2.
The creatures of the dark, vampire hunters.
Virtua Fighter 4.
While Vampire Knight was a simple transition, the next game on this list, Virtua Fighter 4, was not. This legendary fighting sequel was built on the Naomi 2 arcade board, which hardware-wise was well beyond not only the Dreamcast but the PlayStation 2 as well. Of course, this is AM2, the team not only responsible for creating games that defined the industry, but also developed the seminal port of Virtua Fighter 2 for the Sega Saturn, so a PlayStation 2 port was in good hands. the full Virtua Fighter 4 experience makes its way to the PlayStation 2 intact, with gameplay that feels just like the arcade. It has all the characters, all the stages, and a host of extras besides. It's a solid port for the hardware. There are some differences, a drop in resolution and detail, muddy textures on fighters, some noticeable jaggies, and a much more muted colour palette. And while those last two issues may have been improved on if a Dreamcast port ever materialised, it's hard to say whether that could have been on par with the PlayStation 2 port in other ways. Overall, this is undoubtedly one of the greatest fighting games of its generation, if not of all time. There's almost a mini narrative here. The original Virtua Fighter was a huge influence on the development of the original PlayStation, and Sony were undoubtedly huge fans of the series. A decade later, PlayStation had its own console exclusive version that ended up as the best selling game in the series. And while as a long-time Sega fan, it stung a little to see the series celebrated by a fan base and platform that had long derided it, it was great to see Virtua Fighter accepted by the masses in this period, and the game itself absolutely deserved it.
Wanna fight again? You're way out of your league!
Finally, we get to the PS2 Originals, games designed with the PS2 in mind. We saw with Vampire Knight that games specifically created for the hardware could be absolutely sensational, and by this point, Grand Theft Auto 3, Metal Gear Solid 2, Final Fantasy X, Gran Turismo 3, and so many more had shown what other developers could do. And while I could get into the likes of Altered Beast or the Golden Compass, I'm going to start with Shinobi. Originally rumoured to be a Dreamcast title, this is the classic series converted to 3D for the 2000s edgelord crowd. And it's absolutely amazing. This is a brand new story featuring a new character, Hotsuma, taking on the Shinobi mantle as he takes on a world invaded by demons. This is a stylish hack and slash platformer not unlike Ninja Gaiden. You can hack, slash, jump, wall run and dash to overcome enemies and obstacles with huge bosses taking you on at the end of the stage. You wield the Akujiki, a sword that feeds on souls, and if you're unable to defeat enemies quickly enough to satisfy its hunger, it will drain your life away. It's a great mechanic, adding urgency to the adventure, and nailing multiple enemies stylishly is both satisfying and beneficial to your progress. Like Ninja Gaiden, this game is rock hard, just like the series of old, so Shinobi fans absolutely must check this game out. Finally, it's Yakuza. I mean, come on, you knew this one was coming, didn't you? And what a game this is. Admittedly, I only picked up this version recently, and my experience with the first Yakuza story was more based on the Kiwami remakes. I was actually really surprised by how different this is. The camera is more static in most instances, and the movement is more like a 3D beat 'em up than your typical modern third-person game. In terms of themes and gameplay, I don't know how anyone ever said that this was a spiritual successor to Shenmue. As a fan of both series, I mean that in the best way. The first Yakuza is visually impressive, not so much because of the image quality, but the world and the number of NPCs you see on screen. Gameplay is solid too, though it has some mid-2000s jank, but that's something that I find quite endearing. The story is of course superb, as are the side missions, and the voice cast here is absolutely brilliant, with Mark Hamill and Michael Madsen, among others, bringing it all to life.
I'm doing this because he disrespected you.
You there. If you're feeding us bullshit, you're gonna lose more than just a finger.
It may be a little rough around the edges, but this is Sega in full song, with a unique and engaging experience that very much resonates with its key audience. A classic, in my very humble opinion. So there we have it, 10 PlayStation 2 games that I feel show Sega's journey through the PS2. Hopefully the reasons for structuring Sega's games like this are clear. Sega made nearly 200 games for the PS2, and I don't have the means to play and share them all, and it would be a huge video which would probably go on for hours. But here we can see Sega go from porting their Dreamcast and older back catalogue with mixed results, then eventually transitioning from flawed multi-platform games like Sonic Heroes to eventually give us stone cold classics like Outrun 2006, and eventually with games that Sega specifically created for the PlayStation 2 hardware really shining. It was something of a tumultuous journey for the now nomadic Sega fan. At the time, I wandered into the Xbox zone, where the Sega influence seemed a lot more obvious. Others enjoyed Sega's exploits on the GameCube. But Sega's output on the PlayStation 2 is somewhat underrated. After a rocky start, and with a few misses, Sega certainly delivered a number of hits. And with nearly as many games as published by EA or Sony themselves, I'm sure you'll find something on the PlayStation 2 platform to satisfy your Sega itch. If you've made it to the end of the video, thank you very much for watching. Please give us a like or a subscribe if you've enjoyed this content. And hey, why not get in touch via the comments below, because if you'd like to see more Sega content on the PS2 or any other platform, all you have to do is give us a shout. Until next time, this has been Dan the Mega Driver of the Sega Guys, and I will see you on the Sega side.